Um, shall we start?
Yeah, let's go. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, well, I'm joined by Matt Riddle and Matt Carter, the core team members of the Rocketshoes project. The Typehuman team and I have been working with these guys for the last few weeks, so it's my real pleasure to um, spend some time with you guys this afternoon. To start with some formalities, Matt Riddle has over 2 decades of experience in leading digital innovation, transformation, and strategy. Currently, he's the Director of Educational Innovation at La Trobe University in Victoria, Australia. Uh, with previously was a research associate at the Centre for Applied Research in Educational Technologies at the University of Cambridge. Actually, I didn't know that about you. I clearly should have read your bio more. Matt started his career at the University of Melbourne in '93. That's Matt Riddle in multimedia development and e-learning, contributing to a series of award-winning projects over 13 years, which we'll hear a little bit more about as we chat this afternoon. Now, it's going to get confusing because we do have two Matts. So that was Matt Riddle. Matt Carter is the author of Minds and Computers, an introduction to the philosophy of artificial intelligence. Currently, he's Director of Learning Environments and Analytics, also at La Trobe University in Victoria, Australia. And he has an extraordinary breadth of programming, technical, pedagogic knowledge, and has overseen the development of novel whole enterprise systems. Both Matt Riddle and Matt Carter have an extraordinarily diverse background, and this was part of the motivation for kicking off a vlog this afternoon with these two guys. As they've been pushing Rocketshoes forward, it's really hard to communicate a depth of industry experience in a simple white paper, and so we're really looking forward to helping highlight both of these guys' real depth of experience. So if you're here live right now in the Google Hangouts or listening some other way, feel free to ask questions via the chat window or jump into the Rocketshoes Telegram group and we'll keep an eye on things there. If you're watching us after the fact via YouTube, which is where we'll post it, we'd encourage you to jump into the Rocketshoes community group in Telegram, which we'll post the link to do that in the YouTube description once we've posted it. Introduce yourself there to the team, ask any questions that you feel we didn't get to during the interview. Everyone's here to answer questions. So now we'll get straight into the more interesting part, which is to learn a little bit more about Matt Riddle and Matt Carter. So first of all, I'll throw to Matt Riddle. Tell a bit about yourself. Prior to Rocketshoes, what were you doing?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Great to talk to you. And right immediately prior to starting a bit of a focus on this, I was acting Provost Chancellor for Teaching and Learning at La Trobe University. Mm-hmm. And then I took some well-earned leave, and I've got 6 months off to focus on this and my PhD. I'm doing a doctorate at the University of Melbourne on mobile learning broadly. Mm-hmm. I guess I've been involved in educational technology through my entire career. You went through a bit of the history there, but the focus for me has always been on innovation, and it's been on how to, I guess I'm a restless soul. I like to deal with change, and I'm really focused on how we can make the learning experience better for students and also to improve things, particularly with regard to educational technology for everybody in the education space. Mm-hmm. That's me in a nutshell.
Great. So over the last 10 years, maybe focusing on that innovation and change comment you've just made, what's one thing in that space that you think that you're most proud of?
Oh, there's so many projects, but whenever I'm asked about things that have brought about change, I actually think about what has really changed in terms of what the students are doing and how they're experiencing their learning. And a project that always comes up for me is one that's actually been going for a quarter of a century, which ages me a bit. But we were working on a way to think about anatomy at the University of Melbourne all those years ago, and we literally sat in meetings, weekly meetings, for 6 months, trying to reconceive exactly what anatomy, how you teach it, and working with academics in those disciplines to think about that, and came up with this thing called Anatomedia. So people can look at it now. It's anatomedia.com. Don't have any shares, don't make any profit from that. But it genuinely changed the way that anatomy is taught at that university and at many others, because it uses a series of perspectives on anatomy that couldn't have been done with traditional methods. So we moved away from just having pracs and having lectures and things like that to having these rich perspectives that students can explore. And now that's such a huge job to do an anatomy project with all four perspectives for the whole human body, that it's literally taken 25 years for it to be launched. And with all the modules along the way, it's been used throughout the teaching, but now it's absolutely complete with all of the whole human body, which is incredible. So that's an example of really great change that's been brought about through technologies, but there are many more in other areas that I could have highlighted.
Yeah. Hard question to ask. It's kind of like asking who your favourite child is. Everyone says that you don't have a favourite, but deep down inside, maybe there is. Matt Carter, you've had a very interesting career. Explain to us a little bit more about what you did in the AI space, and I guess interested in using that as a segue into learning more about how you transition from an AI author into the learning and education domain.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Nick. It is great to be here, and thanks for hosting today. I came up as a philosopher, an academic philosopher, and I was really interested in philosophy of mind and philosophy of language. And I went to Melbourne University to study for a doctorate there. And that's where I did a little bit of teaching and started getting a little bit interested in the application of technologies to teaching. So I guess I first approached educational technologies from the teacher's perspective, and was a little bit frustrated, I guess, with the state of educational technologies in the late 90s and the early years of this century. And that led to me investing a little bit of time in thinking about how to best harness those educational technologies, but things that I was trying to do in learning and teaching, in philosophy in particular, but broadly in philosophy of artificial intelligence, which is where my research interests were. So I was trying to convey material to students in linguistics, in neuroscience, in computer science, and some core theoretical concepts in philosophy, and stitch those together in an interesting way and try to harness the technologies to make best use of that. That led to a couple of accolades from others at the university for the way I was using technologies in teaching. And then they got me really interested in professional work around educational technologies in universities. So I moved from being a traditional academic, a teaching and research type academic who does some teaching and who does a lot of otherwise sitting in rooms writing papers for the consumption of other academics, to a more professional role in universities, which is what we like to call the non-academic appointments, where I was more involved working with others to harness the power of technologies to teach as best as we were able to teach with the technologies of the day. And that's held me well in the last decade or so. I've moved from university to university. I've been at La Trobe University with Matt Riddle for the last few years. And for the last couple of years, I've been the Director of Learning Environments for La Trobe University. So I'm responsible for their educational technologies. And in that aspect, Matt and I get to work quite closely together, which is always good fun.
Cool. And I want to ask the question, when we've spoken before, you have talked a lot about the learning, I guess, approaches in the AI setting. What was the surprise in now moving into an environment where it's all about teaching people to do things? Is there any surprises or contradictions across teaching people versus teaching machines?
Yeah, well, I guess the available methods for teaching machines are certainly a lot more limited and a lot more direct than the available methods for teaching humans. And I think it's pretty fair to say that the ideas people have about how to effectively teach humans are very wide and varied, particularly at a university. We like to say it's a broad church that's inclusive of a lot of practices. So thinking about harnessing technologies for the use of those is challenging. Is there a substantial difference between the way we teach machines and the way we teach humans? Yeah, absolutely there is. But there's some commonality that can be drawn from both of those experiences that help you think about how you might develop and how you might configure technologies for learning. So I guess one of those examples is reinforcement methods of learning. They've become really powerful in artificial intelligence in the last decade or so, particularly as we've had increasing computational power and much larger data sets. So reinforcement learning has become a really powerful thing. But it's reinforcement learning for human minds as something that we've known as powerful in very particular ways, and we've known that for quite some time. One of the things that I explore in one of my publications is the early history of psychology and what this tells us about the development of current theories of human cognition, human attention, and human memory. And a lot of people would be familiar with really early results from a guy called Ebbinghaus, who showed that memory decays in a particular way. And this leads to the idea that if you want to reinforce learning in humans, particular study habits are really desirable and advisable. And that sort of made its way into common usage and common pedagogies. The idea that you would take notes, that you would rehearse those notes, that you would revisit those notes and try and summarize them after a short period of time. This is all theoretically based, right? So these two intuitions, the idea that there are powerful machine learning methods that are based on reinforcement of data of a particular kind, whose quality is evaluated, is also a very human intuition, and finding ways to put those two things together and harness the power of what we know about human learning from educational settings and what we know about machine learning from academic settings puts us in a really good place to be thinking about developing educational technologies that are best for learning.
Mm-hmm. So I'll throw to either Matt Carter or Matt Riddle here, but what is it about what is it about your experiences over the last, let's say, 5 years that led you to think that Rocketshoes was an important project? And yeah, what's that problem or itch that you're looking to scratch?
I'll have a go first.
Yeah.
I guess Matt and I and others have observed a few things that have been problem spaces or frustration points with regard to educational technologies. And just to reel back the lens just a fair way, I think if you look at the last 20 years, educational technology has moved along, but it hasn't moved along at the speed that you might think it would. We are still using systems that were designed around the 2000 mark. In many institutions, the focus is still on a learning management system that was essentially designed with that set of technologies and with the sort of theory where it was with education pedagogy at that stage, and they haven't really moved along in a really big way since then. There have been a lot of examples of technologies that have been thought to be about to take over. So I can remember it was 1995 and we had VRML and it was going to be all about VR. Well, we're really only seeing AR and VR come, into the public domain through consumer devices in the last few years, and arguably they haven't really changed education all that much, with notable exceptions, but we sort of expected that they'd move along. So part of it is about that frustration of being locked into a set of systems that seem to be more focused around the teacher as a consumer of content, when we know that learning takes place in a way that is much more social than that and is much more about peer-to-peer connections. Think about mentorship, relationships in your own life or in career, and is more about connecting up experiences across your entire life. So joining up what happens in your workplace, if you're working, and most students are working while they're studying these days, is an example of that. But also through your life, connecting up experiences, taking it from your high school experience into your study, and from your university study through to your career and so on. If Kieran was here, and he couldn't join us today because it's his girlfriend's birthday, unfortunately, and
yeah.
Queen's birthday here, and he's not. His girlfriend is not the Queen, by the way. But he would highlight the same sort of thing with regard to school-based technologies at secondary and primary level in particular. So I think that that part of the genesis for this idea is about a frustration with being able to kind of break the mold a little bit and start fresh with something really entirely new.
Great. And Matt Carter, would you add anything there?
Yeah, look, I'd echo the very similar sentiment. Obviously, I mean, there's a reason why we've partnered together to try and solve these problems. From an institutional perspective and from a teacher's perspective, and especially from a student perspective, educational technologies are really not wonderful, and especially in the last decade, we've seen consumer technologies so rapidly outpace educational technologies that their emissions and inabilities to do the kinds of things that we now take as commonplace are becoming really quite glaring and really quite frustrating. So from an institutional perspective, I see us at the university that I represent having a suite of educational technologies that are not necessarily the best technologies for the students, not necessarily the best technologies for the teachers, and not necessarily the best technologies for the institution. And it's frustrating to be in that situation and to observe the available market solutions not necessarily recognising the depth and breadth of the problem there is in educational technologies to be solved by those who have a deep understanding of the various perspectives that are brought to bear on educational technologies and their introduction at institutions like universities and schools like where Kieran works. The advantage that Matt and I have and that Kieran have is that we have this long and vested interest in these other perspectives, not necessarily the technology developer's perspective of education, but the educator's perspective of education and the educational leader's perspective of education, and most importantly, I think, the student's perspective of education. So really that's what's driven me to think about, well, if I can't solve these problems in my day job, if there aren't available solutions to me that do the things that I want them to do, how might I go about solving those problems, and who can I partner with to help solve them?
Mm-hmm. That's great. I mean, there's obviously a whole class of software solutions that are built around higher education and the education sector at large. But we've been seeing, particularly in government settings, we've heard a lot of like enterprise or technology leaders within that setting speak to us about the fact that they're having to cram software solutions that were built for like high-end corporate organizations into their context. And so I think, to paraphrase what you guys were just describing there, is that whilst it's not as bad as government in the sense that there are some classes of software that are built for learning, there's only a few players in that space. So you still end up with a one-size-fits-all software environment across high school students all the way through to higher ed and beyond. So clearly, that's a huge generalization to make, but is that how you guys see it? And I guess, is the mission about unlocking a better technology innovation environment so that more bespoke, tailored solutions can be introduced to those learning scenarios?
I think that's not a bad corollary to make between government and education. It just reminds me that one of the places that I got a lot of inspiration to try and do something about this was I went to the ASU GSV conference last year, which is focused entirely on this problem, this set of problems. It's 3,500 people. If they're not education decision makers in the higher ed space, or school space, they are investors. Mm-hmm. And the common theme was education is broken. And so many different people from the investment side recognise that, but also the stories that we heard in terms of funding, in terms of the appropriateness of technology for what is happening in the change space in education was really consistently about how there's a big gulf. So, and yes, you're right that there are monopolies as well. You only have to look at things like assignment systems, look at how many are on offer. There's not enough players to make it highly competitive, and we sometimes feel a bit wedged with how big some of these providers are, and how difficult it can be to actually move on from that when there's not that many alternatives in some cases.
Yeah, so look, this might be a good time to introduce Rocketshoes. Before we go into the nuts and bolts, where did the name come from?
That's something that I came up with because there's a saying that I always say, which is "Let's get our rocket shoes on," which just means let's jump forward. Let's go more quickly. But when I started to do a lot of reading around the Interplanetary File System (IPFS), which is one of the things at the core of this, and I started talking about how do we get our rocket shoes on in this space, it just suddenly clicked. And then there's a whole bunch of other reasons why it works well with, the rocket metaphors. A core problem that we were looking at when we started conversations, just casual conversations, was if we are going to make big changes and we need to move from some of the existing systems or sort of revolutionise them in some ways, how do we get content from one place to another? So the idea of lifting and shifting also had a nice rocket shoes metaphor. The more we used it, the more it seemed to stick, and it was a code name, and then it's become a company name and a product name as well. So it's stuck with us now.
Awesome. So talk us through the vision for Rocketshoes.
I guess there's a short-term and a long-term vision, and the long-term vision is really to radically change the way that education is experienced. Quite broadly, but the focus that we've got for this particular part of our journey is really on how to make the experience of using digital assets much better, and to leverage decentralized technologies to enable you to do things that are new and different with those. So we're really focusing on digital assets. We think that that's a really important and big jigsaw piece that needs to be right in order to do a whole bunch of other things. And the longer term vision, in terms of that revolutionisation, process, is to think about, rather than learning management systems and big systems where you put everything into them, thinking more about a federated set of systems that can do what I call learning relationship management rather than learning management, that allow you to connect students up to students, that allow students to share what they're doing with other people, or to keep their data to themselves and use it over their learning lives. And that also plays into one of the key other problems in this area, that there's a lot of work around how we should deal with student data at the moment. A lot of work in the learning analytics space, where the idea is to do big data analysis of lots of traces of student usage of the institutional systems and draw out lessons and try to do useful things with them. But the data model is a little bit in question at the moment, in that students can respond quite badly to the idea that they're kind of having someone look over their shoulder all the time. So we want to flip that model around to be able to enable students to own their own data, and then to provide it to institutions for the purposes of assessment or analytics for their own benefit. Mm-hmm. But it should be that those students are able to access what an institution or an organisation knows about them, but also, more importantly, if they're doing creative works, to own those works and to continue to own them, rather than to put them into someone else's system. Mm-hmm. And the same works from the institutional side. So from the institution side, it's got to have ownership over the content that it's paying money to create and that kind of thing. So this question of ownership needs to be properly addressed, and for the data to work in a slightly different way. So that's kind of the longer term vision.
Yeah. So then, is this playing into the GDPR tailwinds?
The GDPR is a great example of an increased pressure on everyone to be better citizens in terms of how you deal with people's data. It's really serious legislation that means that places like universities who do deliver to students in Europe already need to really consider whether their data models do live up to what the requirements of the GDPR are. So just to summarise, I mean, what that legislation says is it says that a student, for example, in the case of a student, could request to have their data given back to them at any time, and they could request for any data that is their own to be deleted. So actually complying with that is a really important priority for institutions, and we think that that might be quite difficult with the way that systems have been set up. And there's not a really great solution for that right now in terms of an all-encompassing solution because of the way it's been collected. Matt Carter, your area is learning analytics. Do you want to comment on that one?
Yeah, learning analytics is all of a sudden a terrifying place to be with the introduction of regulations like GDPR and thinking about how to make existing technology suites do all of the things that, frankly, we should always have been doing when we started collecting user data. Look, I think GDPR, what it shows us is that there's more and more of a drive towards a personalised approach to things, a personalised approach to education, a personalised approach to health. I was quite taken with a story that you might have seen that hit the papers this week. It was a new therapy for breast cancer. It seems to have been quite efficacious, largely by virtue of the fact that it was highly, highly, highly personalised. The idea of personalised approaches to education has been promulgated and discussed for quite a long time, but what there hasn't been is the right way to support a personalised approach with tools. Education, like all of human enterprise, is something that needs to be well supported with tools. And the educational technologies that we have never been tools that put the students first, that put the students in the centre of everything. If you think conceptually, as a philosopher like me likes to do, about the way we approach technologies at large-scale institutions, we take a very institutional first approach. We think about enterprise applications, we think about enterprise-level accounts that have permissions inside of technologies that cascade down through our various user types, one of which are students. And students can do things in these technologies like submit assessments and receive a timestamp, maybe submit on behalf of others if it's a very clever technology, although that's a notoriously difficult problem to solve. But think about that ontology. It started with the institution and cascaded down to the student. But what if the student wants to move to another institution? What if the student would like to know a little bit more about the properties of the object and how it's taken passage through some markers and moderators to resolve in some final feedback that in the future they might be interested in gathering up and putting together with similar feedback in front of an employer as evidence for the attainment of certain skills and abilities and competencies. We can't do that at the moment. We can't take that student-first approach that I've just described. Yes, there are tools in the market. Yes, there are e-portfolio solutions that let you gather up assessment items. But as someone who does this as his day job, let me tell you how extraordinarily difficult it is to deal with the digital objects submitted by students through one method and integrate them with various other technologies and then provide methods of viewing those in other ways. The reason being that these technologies are just not set up in student-centred ways. They're fundamentally architected in what I think we can all call now classical architectures that are enterprise first, that think about data as buckets that are held locally, and where students and their activities are just a small component of what goes on inside them. The whole mission here is to completely turn that inside out, to flip it, to reverse it, to put students first and foremost. That is a student who submits an assessment item and then has quite a lot of say over what should happen with that digital object in the future.
Well said, Matt. To build on that, it's my understanding from reading the white paper that you submitted to NEM Foundation that the MVP of the project then is to facilitate that assignment submission process. And so by doing that, then you're proving out an end-to-end, you're demonstrating an end-to-end experience that puts students at the center. They own the data. Do either of you want to talk through that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's exactly right. Look, starting with the assignment is a really good idea because it's the crux of the matter in terms of how you obtain value within an education system. Frankly, it's the currency of education, right? So if you're submitting an assignment, there is a reason for it to be submitted and time-stamped and to be to get a credential for it that is then shareable on the blockchain. So there's already a lot of people talking about blockchain being a really good way to handle credentialing, but we want to work at the layer of what happens every day and where a lot of transactions happen. It's actually in and around submission of assignments. And actually, assignment submission is a great example of technology that hasn't really moved along all that far in the last 20, 25 years. Essentially, you go to a web page, you press a browse button, you upload it. There are systems to do things like check for plagiarism, and that's important. But in many cases, if you're doing creative work like video submissions or if you want to do group work, plagiarism isn't the key issue, and it's not. It's an area that is just part of the problem. A big part of the problem is actually making sure someone has submitted it on time and that you can provably say that they are the person who submitted it.
Yeah.
And there are ways to game that. So, for example, somebody asked on the forum, and we just ran through this use case, but we all know about a really common use case, which is a person who's got 5 minutes till they have to submit their assignment. They haven't completed it. So what they do is they go onto the learning management system and submit a corrupted file. Now, unfortunately, that might not get discovered for a week or even 2 weeks because someone might be grading a whole bunch of assignments. And at that point, the person tries to open this document and says, oh, it hasn't uploaded properly. I'll go back to the student and ask them to resubmit it. And at that point, the student sends an email with an attachment saying, here's the file with the same name. They can even change the date if they're smart enough. Mm-hmm. There's no correlation between what that student submitted and what was actually ready at the time of the submission. But on the blockchain, you can do that, and especially with using Proxima X, which uses IPFS underneath it, you can have a cryptographic hash. That hash cannot remain the same if you change that document. It, by definition, has to change. So you've suddenly got a way to do a one-to-one correlation between the student work and when it's created, and that's really important. It's also important for reasons of intellectual property and copyright, and there's already people working on those pieces in NEM. So what we'll do is leverage those pieces to apply it to the education space.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, given that we've got a list of questions here from the community that we thought we'd start to run through, and this is where we'd invite anybody who might be listening to chime in on the Google Hangout or in the Telegram channel with questions. But to pull one off the top, talk us through how you imagine. Actually, this is another generic question, but building into the community questions. Talk us through how Rocketshoes will interface with the NEM blockchain.
Yeah. Again, I'll field that one if you like. So for people who aren't aware of Proxima X, it's very cool. Read the white paper. What it essentially does is it very tightly bound around the NEM blockchain. It's a technology layer that does data storage, and as people would know, blockchains are really good at doing transactional stuff. They're not so good at storing big files or to handle the way that storage needs to work in the modern system. So essentially, the integration of Rocketshoes with the NEM blockchain is handled by this middle layer, Proxima X. In terms of what you would do with that and why you would do it, anything that requires a transaction in the education space could benefit from this. So I've already talked through one example, which is assignments, which we think will be really important, but also consider the idea of an institution creating stuff that's of value to another one, or even individual teachers in a school setting sharing their resources with other teachers. There are already kind of halfway house websites that let you share resources as well as students for a fee. I mean, to gain a fee if you're sharing, or you pay $1 and get the resource on how to teach X, Y, Z topic. But if you did that using this solution, you'd have a way to actually ensure authorship, to encrypt it if you want to take a micro transaction and share it much more globally. You have a much better chance at creating a really great experience for people, because you're disintermediating that process. You're letting a teacher work directly with a teacher or an institution, sell directly to an individual without having to go through a middle person.
Yeah.
So it's disintermediation is the reason for the blockchain, just as it is in a financial setting. But in an educational setting, that could be thousands and thousands and thousands of transactions. Just consider the fact that there's a university here in Melbourne that people probably know, RMIT. It has 96,000 students. La Trobe has 33,000 students. There are institutions that dwarf that in China.
Yeah.
So when you have all of those people needing to do things on a daily basis that may need a transaction, you're talking about a huge amount of transactional stuff that can be done in the education space.
Yeah. So certainly there's a big benefit to NEM by helping, or by positioning a solution in the education sector to drive usage. So I guess to replay to any of the audience that might be less familiar, obviously, so the NEM blockchain acts as the hashing, to sort of hash, is that right? But Proxima X is being used as the storage layer, or the storage middleware between the user and IPFS.
Almost, Nick. Yeah, the hashing happens at IPFS layer, actually. So when you create and upload any content at the atomic level, then it gets a cryptographic hash.
Yeah.
Blockchain uses the hash to point to it. So that's how they connect, essentially. It's the connection point.
Okay.
And in IPFS, that is smart enough to know how things are connected together as well. So again, I recommend reading the IPFS white paper. It's really amazing, but it explains how Merkle-Daggs work and that kind of stuff, and which is a rabbit hole I don't want to go down for this, or we'll be still talking here now just about that.
Yeah, sure.
The other advantage, of course, of blockchains in terms of disintermediation is that it disintermediates on the trust problem in education. And in education, trust is really the currency. We're by and large dealing in trust relationships. We're trying to establish and verify that, as Matt said, it was in fact this individual who submitted an assessment. Or, here's a really common use case, group assessment is more and more a normal pedagogy. Often we're expecting groups of students to collaborate around the production of some set of objects and then submit those objects somehow. And that latter bit, submit those objects somehow, that's the bit that I'm responsible for at a university, and that turns out to be really very tricky, actually, getting one student to submit on behalf of a bunch of students. It's not just tricky technically, it's tricky because there's trust problems involved, right? And everyone who's ever done a group assessment knows this. As soon as you say group assessment, people's eyes roll because everyone's been burnt in group assessment because of the trust problem. The very best pedagogical solutions to this that exist at the moment, so pedagogical, I mean teaching practices, a way of using teaching practices to affect teaching outcomes. The best pedagogical solution to the trust problem around group assessment that we see at the moment in higher education is getting students to contract with each other in a way that's public and transparent and available to the teaching staff member, right? But this involves quite a bit of transactional effort. They have to sit down, they have to agree on stuff, they have to document this, they have to submit that as yet another submittable assessment item to the teacher who says, yes, I've received your contract that says John's going to do 10% of this and Mary will do 27% of that. Of course, what the blockchain helps us do at this layer is disintermediate on that trust problem and write smart contracts around the digital object itself that bind to that object for all time and that record in a way that is agreed by all participants, their participation in that group assessment, and then submitted on behalf of that group. That's a real problem that has substantial business value in higher education.
Yeah. Great summary, Matt. So, I mean, and on that, I will throw to some questions that we've got here from the community. Does it get expensive doing transactions on the blockchain in that example you've just given?
I'll let Matt speak to that because my understanding is actually with the solution architecture we've chosen, the opposite of times. Network effects give us a certain amount of advantage.
Yeah.
I guess what's worth noting is if people are not aware, media management solutions, learning management systems are a big business. It can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, sort of $500,000 or more for a learning management system for 1 year. Mm-hmm. So you are talking about something that already costs a lot of money, which is also a business opportunity, isn't it? So what we want to do is in the similar way to existing systems, not provide a system that requires students to incur costs on a daily basis, but to get institutions to bear the cost of these systems, but also to create a system that creates incentive for them to use it. So, and both IPFS and with its Filecoin underpinning it and Proxima X have incentivization approaches. It's best. Somebody asked a question about this in the forum, and I just said it's best asked to look at the documentation from those providers, those projects yourself, or ask those people how those work. We're having those conversations with them as well. Mm-hmm. It's really brand new, but what it has the potential to do is to create the opportunity for a big institution to leverage its considerable bandwidth and disk space to its advantage, to be able to effectively sell that space for anything that's publicly available using these decentralized technologies. Yeah. So that really is a way to offset some of the costs in terms of what you would normally incur with hosting stuff. And the other thing is that what we've observed in terms of educational systems is actually that there are overlaps between a lot of systems. So you have a whole system just dedicated to capturing lectures and storing lectures, and then you have another system for doing personal learning environments, and then you have another system for doing your media management for your organisation for marketing purposes, and then you have all these overlapping functionality things, and then the learning management system itself might often have a media management layer. If you actually looked at a system that used a decentralized approach, you could plug into each of those systems and create the opportunity for savings that you couldn't do with something like, say, YouTube or Vimeo or one of the other publicly available systems, because of the problems that if you put all your content into those systems, you're effectively making it either public domain or you're giving up some of the intellectual property. So we want to provide a way for the glue, I guess, between the decentralized solutions offered that are just coming onto the market with IPFS and Proxima X, and the API level architecture to enable you to connect those into your systems to leverage those capabilities, because nobody's doing that right now.
Mm-hmm. So I guess in summary is purely from a cost perspective, the existing solutions are incredibly expensive, is what you're saying. There's also, I guess you'd call it a fragmented vendor landscape within inside education institutions, so multiple different solutions sort of providing bits and pieces of similar stuff.
Highly fragmented with substantial overlapping affordances.
Yeah. And then on top of that, Rocketshoes via Proxima X, I'm presuming, would support these institutions to run their own IPFS nodes and thus be able to earn Filecoin or what have you. So that would then further offset any costs. Would that be a fair summary?
That's right. So the focus for us would be a service that is like a software as a service business that provides you with the solution, but also helps you to connect it to your existing systems and do those things. And actually, where we want to end up is to make the whole of Rocketshoes open sourced, so that we are actually providing that back to the community and it can be built upon by the community. And the business is actually in applying that and having a really great implementation of that available for different enterprise level applications.
Mm-hmm.
There are some really interesting features of NEM that really help with that. It's again probably good to talk to the people in NEM and also Proxima X, but you can essentially have an entirely private peer-to-peer network if you want to, as opposed to the public peer-to-peer network that's just in IPFS or something like that. And you can also have an entirely private blockchain, as people I'm sure are aware in the NEM community, as well as have the public one. So you can have any combination of those. And you can imagine in corporate settings how it might be useful to have that opportunity to have some things that are on a private network and some things on a public network. Mm-hmm. So there'll be quite a lot around designing services that are fit for purpose in different settings, like compare a primary school setting to a corporate education setting. It might be, a very big company trying to roll out, let's say a bank, trying to roll out a corporate education solution, and they just want to be able to leverage this decentralized storage technique, but plug it into their teaching and learning systems.
Yeah.
That's what we're doing.
Okay, so we're coming up nearly towards the end of our chat. Before we jump into our closing questions, just two more questions from the community. I think the couple of interesting ones would be to talk about perhaps some of the partners around Rocketshoes. So are there any other, I guess, two ways of looking at it? Are there any other edtech companies that you're looking to partner with, or are there other like education institutions that you've already got some early agreements with and can start to work with them? Who have you got around you?
The answer is yes. I mean, it's been interesting just to have conversations with people and find how readily people are willing to come on board to pilot. So I don't think we'll be short of institutions and corporates to trial it. We've already got Warana Park Primary School, which is where Kieran is from, signed up to be an early partner in terms of piloting it in a real learning environment. We absolutely need the pilots to get the best possible product. We've already spoken to one of the big four banks, which I won't name, about the same sort of problems that they're seeing in their corporate education world. We've talked to many others around this and found lots and lots of agreement that this is a problem space they readily recognise. Yeah. I guess the other side to the question is EdTech. We think, and we've got more on this if you want to read more on the Lean Canvas at the end of the white paper, but essentially think about any learning management system that's on the market. We would be looking to work with them to create single sign-on to those things through APIs, LTI integrations for people who are aware of that, that kind of thing, and deeper level connections to specific areas of focus like assignment submission or just provision of EdTech solutions. There are big companies, for example, in Europe, who just specialise in EdTech solutions for whole regions and things like that. So we'd be looking to partner with some of those. Mm-hmm. Another example in the NEM space is Tutorless. People will be aware of Tutorless. We're actually having a video chat later this week with them just to see if we can work with them, because they're providing a different part of the solution. It's really a kind of marketplace solution that uses the blockchain for a different part of this. And they may well want to work with us to do something around this area that we've been talking about today around media management and connecting to systems. So we are really aware that we need to partner to succeed in order to get to where we need to be. And those are some of the ideas we've got so far.
Great. So last few questions. Rocketshoes is going for the NAM Community Foundation grants. The vote went live on Friday. How has that process been going for you guys so far?
I'm blown away by the support, to be honest. I've been checking on it again just before we came on. It's 98 point something % in favour, which is just incredible. And we're really heartened by every conversation we've had, we've presented at a NEM meetup as well. We've had lots of conversations behind the scene with the NEM teams in Kuala Lumpur and here in Melbourne. The Proxima X teams, there's people here in Melbourne, in Sydney, and in Canada, and in the Southeast Asian team. The support has been really amazing. The way that the vote works is it's based on the proof of importance, which means the message has to get out to 3% of the community, and for 3% of the community to vote on it in order for it to be successful. So given that we've got 98% support, really all we need to do now is to make sure that it goes to enough people and that enough people actually vote in the poll to be able to be successful. And that's no mean feat, but we're incredibly heartened by the positive support so far.
Amazing. How has some of the community been reacting around it all? Any particular comments or things that stand out?
Well, I'm really interested that this is a really global community, right? So we're coming at it from, as Australians, coming in and seeing this huge community in NEM, in China, in Korea, in Japan, Spain, Holland, everywhere, you know. So some of the responses of people have been to say, I want to take this into my own community and communicate your value proposition to people because your white paper's in English. Let me help you translate that into Chinese, and let me help you take it into Spanish. And I've had people from Holland. I speak a bit of Dutch myself, but it's not good enough to translate the whole white paper because it's got technical language. People telling me they'll translate into Dutch and get the message out, because we have to kind of get it out on a regular basis. We've got 10 days to do the vote, and then it closes on the 18th of June at 7 p.m. Melbourne time. So the challenge is to get it to all those eyes and ears as soon as we can, to be able to give them enough chance to digest what the value proposition is and then vote. Yeah. So anybody watching this could help us with that. You're more than welcome. But I'm really amazed at how people have just come in and said, how can I help? Which is wonderful.
Yeah. Is there any other support that you guys would be looking for at the moment?
It'd be great if people got into the community forum and asked questions, whatever questions you have, because if you've got a question, somebody else will have it. I've been in there answering questions last night, and there were some things in there I hadn't thought weren't clear, you know, and there are some things that I hadn't really thought of addressing. You know, somebody asked what proportion of NEM traffic is our, on the NEM blockchain is our target. Well, yeah. I don't know how exactly to answer that yet. So they're really good things to ask, and we just want your engagement, and we want you to work along with us on how you think the vision should work. People can join our Telegram community. That's growing quickly. So if you just search for Rocketshoes community on Telegram, you can find us. It's a public community, and people can search for Rocketshoes _IO on Twitter, and they can just hear about what we're doing and retweet stuff that we're doing if they want to support us and that kind of stuff. So yeah, there are plenty of avenues.
Right. Matt Carter, anything you'd add to that in terms of community reaction through the voting period or otherwise?
Like Matt, I've been incredibly heartened by the overwhelmingly positive response, and really it just tracks our experience throughout the inception and growth of this idea, particularly over the last 6 months as Matt's really led forward and made a lot of new connections. We're yet to find anyone who doesn't understand clearly where the value of the idea is, and that's really encouraging for us.
Well, I think that's where we'll leave it for this afternoon. I'll say a huge thank you to Matt Riddle and Matt Carter for joining us this afternoon, and good luck. We'll watch the voting process closely over the next few days, and would encourage everybody to join that Telegram group. We'll post some links in the comments to wherever this video ends up. It could end up on either our YouTube or the Rocketshoes YouTube. But yeah, best of luck, and super excited to see how NEM and the blockchain can end up in the education sector.
Thanks to you, Nick, and I'll be around in the Telegram channel just after this to answer any questions that people have after hearing all that. So, thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks everyone in the NEM community.